It was a moonless night when the river tasted of metal, and the smoke from the sugarcane burning hung low over the ingenio, a scent that never left the nostrils of those who worked there. Rosa, thin as a reed and with a scar the color of old bread across her wrist, moved through the yard carrying a wooden spoon, worn smooth by years of stirring. The Casa Grande stood luminous and indifferent on the hill, while beyond, in the low lights of the senzala, secrets kept time with the tide. The truth I will tell was the one the town would not write in its books. If this story seizes you, leave a like and subscribe so these voices do not vanish with the smoke. "Quiet," she whispered to the night, and the wind answered with the creak of a gate, as if the world itself leaned to listen. It was the year 1848, on the banks of a wide river where the plantation of São Vicente breathed sugar and debts, and where a coronel named Rodrigo de Alencar kept watch like a statue that sometimes woke at night. The household was a small kingdom of rituals and titles. Colonel Rodrigo, known for his iron waistcoat and a voice that could tighten a throat, ruled with a ledger and a prayer book. Donna Isabella, his sister, tended to the house with hands that could sew and punish in equal measure, and she kept the parlor curtains drawn against gossip. Benedito, the overseer, walked the fields with boots that left a rhythm on the earth and a ledger of names in his head. Zepha, the chief mukama, understood the calendar of bodies and meals better than any priest. Father Bento said Mass on Sundays and whispered absolution in private. Manuel, a free craftsman from the neighboring village, came and went with repairs and small talk that smelled of sawdust. Henrique, a schoolteacher who read forbidden poems aloud under the mango tree, carried a gentleness that unsettled the household like a lantern left open. Joaquim, a field hand with hands like knots and a laugh that came from the throat, harvested cane with a precision that made the workers call him Professor when they wanted to tease him. These characters moved through the estate, each with a role that sustained the hierarchy the same way the river sustained the mill. The marriage arrangement patterns were named and sealed at dinner tables, a trade in alliances, a price that mothers counted with their mouths closed. The colony of servants and cativos learned that honor was a currency the señor and coronel kept for themselves. Rosa had been born on the plantation, a child of seasons and quiet resistances. Her backstory lay folded like a cloth in 3 careful paragraphs, a history she carried like a hymn. As a child, she remembered her mother humming a song that smelled of bay leaves, teaching her to count days by the moon and to hide a stolen mango skin in the shirt for a later sweetness. She learned to read the weather as her mother read the faces of the elders, and she learned to sew promises into hems so that memory might survive the passing wash. Her young years had been stitched with the small rebellions of a girl learning to keep her own time inside another person's clock. When she was 12, the mother was sold at auction to a fazenda beyond the mountains, and that absence taught Rosa how to name sorrow without breaking it. As she grew, Rosa apprenticed as mukama under Zepha and found in chores a cadence that steadied a heart that wanted sometimes to thunder. In her early 20s, she had a trade and a knowledge of herbs that the house trusted. She could soothe fevered children and ease the aches of old men. This formation shaped her present resolve. The loss of her mother had left a scar that was not visible, but that made her cautious of promises and ruthless in guarding the few liberties she had. These memories connected directly to the secret she would later keep, because the price of speaking was a sale that would erase names and fathers and the little carved spoon she always carried. Her interaction with other people formed her as much as any upbringing. Manuel repaired the kitchen door and left splinters of wood and talk that worried the house. Joaquim caught her eye between dawn and dusk with the kind of gaze that catalogued things and then returned them altered. Enrique read lines of verse to the children and lured the minds of the curious with talk of distant cities and books. Father Bento offered curses and comfort, sometimes in equally warm measures. These men were the strands that braided around her life. Each added a color and a risk.
It began on a morning so humid that the air felt like wet cloth against the skin, when the sugarcane rustled like an old man clearing his throat. Joaquim was patching a fence by the river where the reeds gathered secrets. The scene held the sun, the smell of river mud, the metallic tang of the machete, the roughness of rope, the sweetness of the mango he had tucked into his shirt. Their first encounter unfolded in words and silences, and it was a conversation with 8 turns that changed everything. "Good morning," he said, wiping his brow. "Good morning," she answered, feeling the spoon press at her palm. "You work fast," she said with a small smile. "There is no time for slowness," he replied, bending over the slats. "Do you ever rest?" she asked. "Rest is a future luxury," he said, and looked up at the sky. "Do you ever wish for different work?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "Sometimes I imagine a place without cane, without a ledger," he said. "Where would you go?" she asked. "I do not know," he admitted.
"Perhaps to the sea, where no one keeps accounts," he said, and laughed softly. "Would you come?" she asked, daring the shape of her own thought. "If I could, I would not ask," he said, and for a moment the world narrowed to a patch of river and 2 breathing bodies. "Be careful," his voice lowered. "I will be," she promised, and in that promise the seed of danger sprouted. Their meetings multiplied like hidden birds. Joaquim taught Rosa how to move through the cane without making a sound. He showed her where the earth gave up crabs and where the water had a taste of iron. He taught her to listen to the rain as if it spoke advice. In those nights, the senses multiplied. The rough of his palm against her wrist, the salt of his forehead after work, the low cadence of his voice as he read aloud from memories rather than books, the smell of river mud on his skin, the taste of stolen sugar on both their tongues. The passion was a fire that warmed and burned with equal appetite. One evening, Manuel found them in a shadowed doorway, and his reaction set a new tension. Manuel was not like Joaquim. He was free, and he carried the geometry of a craftsman in his hands. What grew between Rosa and Manuel was a tenderness of minds, not only bodies. He read to her in the dim of the pantry, poems stolen from a traveler, pressed against a crave of coffee beans that smelled like distant ports. Their conversations were long and winding, and they produced another set of exchanges that deepened the narrative and complicated loyalty. "You are hiding too much," Manuel observed while tracing a grain in the wood. "I have to," she said. "Hiding keeps people safe," he said. "Sometimes it keeps them silent," she replied. "What do you want, Rosa?" he asked, earnest. "To be named," she said. "Named in a way that does not belong to others." "Then say it," he urged. "My name is Rosa Maria," she said, and when she spoke it aloud, it felt like an offering. "Rosa Maria," Manuel repeated, tasting it like a syllable of a foreign song. "Do you fear Rodrigo?" "I fear what he will do when he knows," she said. "Then we will build a place where he does not govern," he declared softly. "I do not know if places can be built from whispers," she murmured. "They begin with a single brick," he insisted. The exchange between them moved slowly as a tide, full of intellect and a promise of escape that was as fragile as a paper boat. The third strand entered like a storm. Colonel Rodrigo de Alencar was not a silent tyrant. He was afternoon and ledger and the smell of his tobacco. At night, he walked the plantation to see that everything was as it should be. He walked into the slave quarters with a light step that made the dogs uneasy. His nights there became a rumor that smelled of fear and a strange need. Rosa encountered him once in the wash-house where the clothes hung heavy with river scent. He watched her with an attention that belonged to ownership and to something else that could not be named cleanly. "Come here," he said, and the word was both command and an invitation. "No," she said at first. "You are not in the habit of refusing me," he said, and smiled with a mouth that had eaten too many promises. "I do not belong to you," she answered. "You belong to the estate," he corrected. "You belong to no ledger," she insisted, and in that insistence a contest began.
Their conversations were a series of 10 exchanges that shifted like the positions of the stars. "Why do you resist?" he asked. "Because I remember mothers," she said. "You remember only what you have been told to pity," he countered. "I remember the work," she said. "And I remember the market," he muttered. "Do you think I have no will?" she demanded. "You have always had the will to survive," he conceded. "Survival is not always choice," she replied. "Choice can be dangerous," he whispered. "Danger is a shape I know," she said. "Then accept my danger," he said. And the night between them widened with the echo of decisions. After such nights, the household hummed with conjecture. Zepha noticed the way Rosa folded a cloth and stitched it differently. Benedito catalogued late returns and corrected them with new tasks. Dona Isabella tightened the curtains and sharpened her gaze. Father Bento prayed with a friction that sounded like someone clearing a throat. The gossip traveled through neighbors like smoke. Señor Alvaro, who owned a nearby mill, commented at a market that the colonel walked too often where he should not. Captain Correa, a man of law and a man of convenience, kept his ears open for a complaint that would serve a ledger or a purse. The network of people who mattered now contained 8 names that acted and reacted to the secret, and their actions escalated the tale. At this moment, when the stakes had grown and the audience had become wider, I ask you to pause and speak. If the weight of this scene touched you, tell us about the silences in your family. Comment beginning with "my family," so we can hear what has been kept like a coal in the chest. These stories matter because they untangle how private sorrow connects to public structures. Your words help build a map for other listeners. Share one sentence and let memory unfasten its knot. After that, return with me and we will follow how whispers found a mouth. The exposure came not from a single brave heart, but from an accumulation of needs and fears. A servant named Anna, who feared the colonel and loved her children more, chose to exchange silence for safety and told Dona Isabella of a night she had seen. "She was there," Anna said, wringing her apron. "I saw her leave the wash-house with him." Dona Isabella frowned, her lips folding like paper. She told Father Bento, who worried not only for sin, but for how sin might unsettle the parishioners. Manuel was pushed into a corner and questioned without notice. Joaquim was beaten one night for an error in the cane harvest, his laughter replaced by an incomprehensible silence. The town gathered like vultures when a rumor smelled of scandal. Conversations in the mercado took on the texture of a trial. "It cannot be true," Professor Alvaro said at a tavern, his voice thin. "It is true," Benedito countered, "and a truth that must be corrected." The colonel convened a council of men in his office, the air heavy with tobacco and the crackle of maps. Father Bento balanced scripture and practicality. Captain Correa offered law that could punish or absolve, depending on which side held coin. A complaint was filed by Dona Isabella, she who balanced family honor and the ledger of the house. And with that complaint, the secret became public and the power of rumor curdled into a formal accusation. The first moment of tension occurred at the public meeting under the mango tree when names were spoken like verdicts. The crowd smelled of sweat and dust, of coffee and crushed cane. The colonel sat with his chin raised and his hands folded, a posture of patient thunder. "Who will answer for this?" he demanded. "It was Rosa," Benedito said. "It was Joaquim," Anna said. "It was the colonel who welcomed them," Manuel protested. Voices braided into a net of accusations, each aimed to catch a certain truth and a certain scapegoat. The parish clock continued to mark the hour, even as reputations shifted. For Rosa, the world tightened. She felt the spoon in her pocket like a relic, and the memory of her mother stitching names in hems. The crowd decided before law could, because decisions here were often swift and brutal. What followed was a punishment that wore many faces. Rosa and Joaquim were taken separately. Joaquim received lashes in the clearing, the flogging administered with a cruelty that made the earth witness with a sound like swallowing. The description of the whipping must be slow, so that the reader recognizes the cruelty, the rope grating on skin, the smell of blood and dust, the way children had to be turned away. He fell, and the cane smelled differently after that, undercut by iron and salt. Rosa was locked in a small room of the Casa Grande at first, and then presented before a private council, where the colonel offered deals in low words. "Confess," he told her. "Name the others." "I will not sell their names," she answered. "You will be sold if you do not," he said. "What price do you put on a life?" she asked. "A price that the
ledger will accept," he replied. "I refuse," she said. And in that refusal the colonel saw his power fray. For his part, Rodrigo feared the scandal that might reach his peers and the inspectors, and he feared the tarnishing of his name in the registers kept by men like Captain Correa. The pressure produced compromises and betrayals. Juan, a young cativo who sought favor, testified in a voice that trembled, and thus the mechanism of accusation churned. The moment of public punishment rippled outward. Joaquim was sold to a fazenda beyond the river, where the cane was crueler and the overseers were less courteous. Manuel was threatened with arrest on a fabricated charge that would send him north. Father Bento, pressed by conscience and by the colonel's gratitude, offered a half absolution that tasted like paper. Zifa and Anna were reassigned to harsher tasks, their names scrubbed in new registers. A ledger was closed on some lives and opened on others. The conversations in the village turned to pity and to relief. "It is for the order," Benedito said in a voice that disguised a tremble. "Order has a price," murmured Donna Isabella, who had paid with quiet alliances. The scar on Rosa's wrist pulsed like a secret lamp. A second moment of tension slowed the narrative to examine private coercion. Colonel Rodrigo began to assert a possession that looked a lot like a relationship, offering promises of freedom in exchange for silence. He took her once more into the Knights of the Senzala and spoke of Alforia as if it were a coin to be spent and not a right to be earned. "I can grant you freedom," he said, his breath smelling of tobacco and rum. "I would rather be free without the colonel's mercy," she replied. "Mercy is a currency I can spend," he insisted. "Then spend it on someone else," she said. The conversation rotated like a slow knife. In the end, he placed a document on the table with words that could be read two ways. She took the document, and she did not sign. To sign would be to trade one master for another, and to accept a ledger that listed a name as property transferred. She folded the paper with her fingers, imagining the mango song her mother used to sing, and she tucked it away in the hem of her dress. In those weeks, the estate was a theater of small torments. Joaquim's absence was a constant drumbeat. Zifa found new tasks that aged her forward by a decade. The colonel tried to make the narrative tidy by offering a public donation to the church and by hosting a feast that smelt of roast and reconciliation, but the air tasted of ash. Enrique read aloud in the schoolyard poems of exile, and the children listened wide-eyed. And it was he who taught the smallest ones that words could be bridges and that sometimes names could be kept. "We must keep remembering," he told them. "Memory is a small revolt," Rosa responded when she allowed herself to speak quietly in the school's shade. Time moved like a patient tide, and the consequences layered. 1 month after the scandal, Joaquim was gone, sold across the river with a name changed and a body that remembered lashes. 3 months later, Manuel fled at dawn, his hands raw from making a packing of tools and loose coins, leaving a note woven into a cloth for Rosa that read simply, "Remember the mango." 6 months passed, and the house had shifted its furniture of power. Donna Isabella had remarried a merchant from the town, with investments and a taste for quiet. Father Bento had been reassigned to a parish where the congregation was smaller and the murmurs fewer. Captain Correa had accepted a promotion and an apple of his own, and Colonel Rodrigo kept his knights but ceased to speak of them aloud.
Rosa, after 6 months, had a small box with the document she refused to sign, a wooden spoon whose handle bore her mother's initials, and a name she held like a prayer. The final reckoning was not a grand trial, but a slow unmaking. The community that had once rallied quickly to the colonel's protection now saw the fractures of an order that relied on silence and submission. Some men moved with regret. Joaquin's name became a whispered lament, spoken by an old man at the river who had once shared a cup of water. Manuel's escape became a story told to children about the risk of choosing a horizon. Zepha kept the watch of a woman who had lost a friend and gained a caution. Anna left the plantation quietly with 2 children and a basket of herbs. Benedito retired with a limp that made him kind in his room. These were measurable consequences: a sale, an exile, a job lost, a body changed. In the epilogue, there were 3 marks of time that mattered. 1 month after, the plantation operated as if nothing catastrophic had occurred. Yet the workers whispered in corners, and names were no longer safe to say at table. 3 months after, fragments of songs returned to the senzala, small reparations in the form of shared mango and secret readings at night. 6 months after, Rosa walked to the river before dawn and let the water wash the feel of the house from her palms. She had no formal alforria, no stamped document of freedom, but she had something that weighed differently: the spoon with her mother's initials, Manuel's note tucked inside, and a refusal that had not been purchased. She began to teach the smallest children to count with the moon and to sing the bayleaf song, so that the memory of names might persist beyond ledgers. Father Bento grew old with a conscience that sometimes kept him awake. Colonel Rodrigo continued to be
called Señor, and yet in some rooms he was spoken of in the past tense as if the very habit of titling him could not contain the stain. When the story receded into the quiet of memory, there remained a sentence that folded the history like a hand closing a book. The Casa Grande stood, centuries of timber and smoke, but fissures followed the lines where people had refused to be property. Rosa did not leave with the pump of alforria papers. She left with songs sewn into hems and a handful of names that could not be sold. To remember is to keep an account that no ledger can erase. If this account moved you, subscribe, and keep these voices in your listening, because memory is a form of justice. This is not a story tidy with redemption. It is a story that insists on being told so that similar silences do not go unchallenged. Remember the names that the register tried to bury, and do not let the night swallow what the day must know.